Hi, everyone. Welcome to J School. We're just seeing some people join the webinar, so we're going to give it a minute or two. So bear with us, please. Welcome to those who are just joining. Welcome to those that are just joining. We're just going to give it another minute or two while we wait for others to join the webinar.
Can we put the caricature on while we're waiting?
Sure.
There we go.
Okay, I think we're going to start, and we will bring that caricature back very soon. Welcome, everyone, to our second to last session of J Street. Thank you to everyone who's joining across time zones, countries, states, cities. Really great to have you. My name is Abby Kirschbaum, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement and Educational Resources at J Street. We are now in our second to last week of J School, which is an educational series that we designed at J Street for those looking to develop their knowledge on the conflict and to deepen their understanding of its complexities. So this week, in our second to final week, this will be an opportunity for us to learn from negotiations expert Dr. Galia Golan about the ways in which historical peace talks have attempted to lay the foundations for a negotiated end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From Oslo to Madrid, each negotiation attempt has shown that there are 5 core issues that surface as the key sticking points to reaching any agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. Over the next 50 minutes, Dr. Golan, who I will introduce very shortly, will examine how and why these 5 core issues, Jerusalem, borders and security, refugees and settlements, continually arise in peace negotiations. Our next hour will be taught and led by Dr. Galia Golan, a leading expert on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Dr. Galia Golan is a professor emerita of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Golan was chair of the political science department. She is the author of 10 books, most recently Israeli-Palestinian Peacemaking since 1967, Factors Behind the Breakthroughs and Failures. She is co-editor of a number of additional books, including with Gilad Sher, Spoilers and Spoiling in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and with Walid Salem of Non-State Actors in the Middle East for Democracy and Peace. A member of the National Executive of Meretz since 1992, Dr. Golan is also a member of the editorial board of the Palestine-Israel Journal. She was a founder and leader of Peace Now until 2014, when she joined the leadership of Combatants for Peace. She was a founder leader of the Jerusalem Link, a joint Israeli-Palestinian venture for peace, as well as the leader of the International Women's Commission. Women's Commission, oh, right. Jerusalem Women's Venture for Peace, as well as the International Women's Commission for a Just Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and also the founder of Israel's first Women's Studies Program and Research Center at the Hebrew University. Dr. Golan has received numerous awards, including the Gleitzman International Activist Award, the New Israel Fund Women in Leadership Award, the International Studies Association's Distinguished Scholar Award, and also its Scholar Activist Award and the Israel Political Science Association Award for Lifetime Contribution. And I will just say before I introduce Dr. Golan that she was actually my professor and first introduced me to the concepts that we are about to learn here. So this is going to be a very interesting and insightful presentation, which I'm sure many of you will learn a lot from. And so before I actually bring in Dr. Golan, I'm going to just lay out a few housekeeping items for us to keep in mind and just sort of break down the structure of the session. So first and foremost, Dr. Golan will take us through the presentation and talk about the 5 core issues of the conflict. She will be referring to a PowerPoint presentation, which I will share and we will go through in order to convey the presentation. We are going to have 10 minutes at the close of the presentation for Q&A. We very much encourage you, as in previous weeks, to ask whatever questions you might have. As we all know, this material can be complex and very convoluted, so it's really important, and we really encourage people to ask as many clarifying questions as you feel necessary to contribute to the conversation. And as always, as in previous weeks, we are going to be doing a discussion session led by J Street staff after the close of the session. So you can find the link of that Zoom conversation in the chat box that somebody will upload very shortly. So without further ado, Dr. Galia Golan.
Okay, hi. I'm really very pleased to be here. I'm a great fan of J Street since before you were created, just so you know that. Actually, I want to give you first some critical background. Let's go to the PowerPoint number 2, the map. When I showed can you go to the next PowerPoint? There we go. I just want this to be clear of what the mandate was, if you take a good look at it. What happened is basically after the Ottoman Empire was dissolved following World War I, the British got the mandate for Palestine, and they very quickly took a chunk of it and gave it to Jordan. As you can see on the map, it was then called Transjordan. So when we talk about mandated Palestine, or even when we talk about Palestine, we really mean what was left after the British created Transjordan. Then we go on to the next slide. We have the next slide, please. We have the partition plan. There we go, which some of you may be familiar with, the partition plan of 1947, which gave 55% of the land of Palestine to the Jews, even though the Jews owned only 6% of the land, and 45% went to the local population, the Palestinians, even though there were twice as many of them as there were of the Jews at the time. But that was the decision. And we'll go to the next slide. We had the War of Independence. And this is where we begin to get the green line, the new border, because the war did not end with a peace agreement. There were armistice agreements, which said very, very clearly, these are not final borders. They simply are the lines where we stopped fighting, and we agreed that this is more or less where we'll have the armistice. But these were not final borders. Israel, by the way, has had no final eastern border ever. So there we are. But these were the armistice lines. And if you'll see there, the West Bank went to Jordan. And I think this is extremely important because the Jordan annexed the West Bank, and it gave Jordanian citizenship to all the people living there, which were Palestinians, most of whom were in fact refugees from the rest of Palestine. So what happened in 1949 is that, and 1950, Jordan annexed the West Bank, and I think we can go on to the next slide. Just so you see, this is the green line. West Bank belongs to Jordan, and the blue part was Israel. But as I said again, these were not permanent borders. There were armistice lines. There were little exchanges of territory. But this is the way this is the green line, and this is the way things were until 1967. I just want to add one very important thing. Only 2 countries in the world recognized Jordan's annexation of the West Bank, Pakistan and Great Britain. Now, Jordan's annexation of the West Bank included East Jerusalem. Nobody recognized that because the partition plan said that East Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, was supposed to be international, sort of run by the UN. But the annexation of the West Bank to Jordan was recognized by 2 states. Israel took the rest of it. If you take a look at the partition plan and you look at this, if you look at the green line, Israel actually greatly expanded that 55% territory, and nobody recognized those annexations. So we're sitting in, let's say we're sitting in pre-war 1967. Israel is sitting in territory way beyond the partition plan, never recognized by anybody. And Jordan is sitting in the West Bank as well, recognized only by Great Britain and Pakistan. In 1949, Israel moved its government buildings to West Jerusalem because Jerusalem was divided as a result of the 1948 war, with Jordan sitting in East Jerusalem. Israel declared West Jerusalem as our capital. Nobody recognized that to this day. Until Trump, nobody recognized Jerusalem, even West Jerusalem, as the capital of Israel. Now, what I want to explain, and we'll stay with this, with these borders, so maybe let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the situation after the Six-Day War. And I want to explain something very basic here in the way of background. In the course of the Six-Day War, Israel occupied Sinai, occupied the Golan Heights, and occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel, well, this is, I think, important to understand, whether it's an occupation or it's not an occupation. In international law, it's occupation, period. But Israel claims to this day, at least the foreign ministry claims, that it's not an occupation. They claim that because almost nobody recognized Jordan's annexation of the West Bank in the early 1950s, actually, the foreign ministry claims there was no sovereign over the West Bank before Israel moved into it in 1967. Therefore, the official claim by Israel is that this is not occupied territory, it is disputed territory, just the West Bank and East Jerusalem, disputed territory. It's extremely important because if it's occupation, as the rest of the world, of course, says it is, then the Geneva Conventions apply. And the Geneva Conventions are very clear about things you cannot or cannot do, can or cannot do as an occupying power. And one of the things that you cannot do is create settlements. As a matter of fact, right after, we go back to that, go back to the former slide. Right after the Six-Day War, the government of Israel asked for a legal opinion from the foreign ministry, can we build settlements? And the answer was no. The answer was no. According to international law, we cannot build settlements, but we went ahead and we built settlements. The other thing, I think this is obviously an extremely important fact to remember to this day. The territory, according to everybody except the government of Israel, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is occupied. Let's go on now to Jerusalem. After the Six-Day War was over, the next slide, please. Israel annexed East Jerusalem, officially annexed East Jerusalem, extended Israeli law, but it also expanded East Jerusalem. You can see by this map, Israel expanded Jerusalem basically to about way beyond our regular size. And as I said, extended Israeli law to Jerusalem, to East Jerusalem. There's lots more we can say, of course, about Jerusalem. But I think we can skip. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please, Abby. If we can get to the next slide. No luck. We're stuck with Jerusalem. I'm a Jerusalemite, so I feel very good about that. The thing is, I think we can probably skip to 1988. Although Israel annexed East Jerusalem and began building settlements there, we call them neighborhoods, but they are settlements. Of course, the Palestinians claim that these settlements are illegal. By the way, when Israel annexed East Jerusalem, it did not give citizenship to the couple 100,000 Palestinians living there. It made them into permanent residents. Permanent residents do not have the right to vote except for the city council. They also can lose their right to live there very easily if they go abroad for too long a period, if they study abroad or something. It's a very, very shaky status, although they get Social Security Social Security insurance and things like that. But it's a very, very shaky status, permanent residence, but not acknowledged, certainly not citizenship. If we go to 1988, if we can get the next slide. Oh, there we go. And I say that because basically nothing more happened in that period between 67 and 88 on the Palestinian issue. In 1988, the PLO decided for a number of reasons to take a more pragmatic track. And instead of trying to create a state in all of Palestine, all of mandated Palestine, they took what they called their historic compromise and they said, okay, we accept partition. We accept that there is a Jewish state, which is called Israel, and we will try to create a state. We're demanding to create a state only in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and in other words, a two-state solution. And they recognized Israel's right to exist within secure and recognized borders and renounced the use of terror. The important point here is that this is what made the two-state solution possible when the Palestinians gave up their claim to all of mandated Palestine. So this is obviously extremely important background. And now I think we can go on to what happened after 1988. So I think we can go on really to Oslo. If we go to the next slide. The Oslo Accords came about mainly because the situation had changed. The Palestinians had been, as I said, they agreed already in 1988 for a two-state solution. By the early 90s, they were very weak. The PLO was very weak. The Soviet Union was on the way out. And most important, the Intifada had broken out in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which brought a tremendous amount of pressure from below upon the PLO to do something. And also, as a result of the Intifada, Jordan gave up its claim to the West Bank in favor of the Palestinians. For the Israelis, the Oslo Accords were really the result of the changes that took place in the world. Rabin, when he was elected in 1992, acknowledged these changes. He was also concerned about the spread of Islamism, the rise of Iran, and of course there was the issue of the Intifada. And so Rabin came up with, or agreed to, basically, the Oslo Accords, which were negotiated more by Shimon Peres and his people. We can go to the next slide. The Oslo Accords were obviously a transition because Rabin believed that it was going to take time to build trust and to reach an agreement. But the most important part of the Oslo Accords, in my opinion, were the exchange of letters between Rabin as prime minister and Arafat as head of the PLO. And this letter is from the PLO, from Arafat, signed by Arafat. And the important thing is what I've highlighted. The PLO recognized, and you've got to pay attention to this, the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security. The right, not just the recognizing us, but the right of Israel to exist within peace and security and accept resolutions and so on and so forth. This is the important part of it. And that really can't be undone. They recognized our right to exist. I emphasize this because Netanyahu claims the Palestinians never recognized our right to be here, the legitimacy. In any case, we go on now. As I said, Oslo Accords, next slide, please. The Oslo Accords were temporary. They were a transition because Rabin believed it was going to take time, so there were several stages. We can go on to the next slide. Next slide. If you just sort of sum up the Oslo principles and the Oslo Accords, there was actually 7 accords. The problems with them, in my analysis, is they were an interim agreement, not a final agreement. So nobody really knew what was going to be the end game. There was no end game. It never said, we're going to have a Palestinian state, we're going to have an end of the conflict. Nobody really knew where we were going and what sacrifices might be worth making. The Islamists, not the PLO, but the Islamists began terror attacks immediately. There were delays, there was no monitoring. And Israel continued to build settlements because settlements were not part of the Oslo Accords. And Israel set up all kinds of roadblocks. That's when they started, because Israel had responsibility for the settlers, for the roads, and for external security. But nonetheless, the Oslo Accords did lead to a great deal of optimism. They led to the peace agreement in 1994 with Jordan. We doubled diplomatic relations. We had an economic investment and a lot of people-to-people accords. We can go to the next slide, and we're actually then going to get to negotiations. I should mention the Oslo II Accords that came just before Rabin was assassinated in 1995. And this is important because in Oslo II set up areas for future redeployment. In other words, we'd already begun redeploying or withdrawing for certain parts of the West Bank. And they set up a timetable for another set of withdrawals that were supposed to take one after the other. And so they set up these very temporary areas called Area C, which is all the white stuff in the West Bank, Area B, which is the light brown or orange stuff, which were Palestinian villages, and Area A, see, C is the white, A were areas that were actually handed over to the Palestinians. Those are the major cities. So the Palestinians there would have full control. We can go to the next slide. You can see it more clearly. Next slide, please, Abby. The problem here with areas A, B, and C is they were meant to be temporary. C would become B, B would become A, and in the final status would determine exactly where the new borders would be. The problem is that, of course, the Oslo Accords got frozen, and areas A, B, and C got frozen once Netanyahu came to power, and that's where we are today. Area A is the cities that the Palestinians control. B is joint control, Palestinian civil control, Israeli security control, and Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, is under full Israeli control. That's where we are today. This was never meant to be permanent. This was not part of the Oslo agreements. It was supposed to be a movable map, which after every 6 months, Israel would withdraw more from Area C. C would become B, B would become A. But that didn't happen. So now we can go to the negotiations themselves. Barak, when he came to power in 1999, decided to skip the further redeployments or evacuations or withdrawals and go immediately to the final status talks. Palestinians weren't too happy about that, but still we went to final status talks at Camp David. And this is a map of what we think Barak offered, in quotes, at Camp David. It is more than any Israeli government ever suggested or proposed in the past, but it wasn't very good. The idea on the Israeli side was to try to accommodate as many settlers as possible, to not have to withdraw or take down too many settlements. And so they came up with this sort of territorial idea, which not only meant that Israel would annex a good part of the West Bank to accommodate maximum number of settlers, but Israel also wanted to annex the Jordan Rift Valley in order to have a security buffer and have roads or areas connecting Israel to the Jordan Rift Valley. You can see them in blue there, which really would have divided the West Bank into 3 sections. Now, I want to explain something about the core issues at Camp David. The core issues, as Abby mentioned, were the refugees, the settlements, security, borders, Jerusalem. So at Camp David, the borders were, as you can see here, this is what Israel proposed. The refugee issue was theoretically resolved in talks that preceded the Camp David talks, where the Palestinians said, look, what we want you to do is to acknowledge Israel's role in the creation of the refugee problem, and then we can talk numbers. By the way, in terms of the origins of the refugee problem, in the 48 war, Israel deported or transferred Palestinians from their homes out of the area that Israel wanted to hold on to, and claimed that in fact the Palestinians fled. Both things, by the way, are true. Of course, in the course of the war, many Palestinians simply fled out of fear, as you do in a war, but most of them were actually put on buses or trucks and driven out. Some 600,000 refugees were driven out. And what made them officially refugees is that on June 13, 1948, the Israeli government passed a decree saying they cannot return. And that's what makes them a refugee. They could not return. And Israel considered the refugee issue as one that could be discussed only as part of a final peace agreement with the Arabs. So that's the refugee issue, whereas the Palestinians at Camp David, prior to Camp David, thought they had an agreement with Israel. You acknowledge your part in the creation of the problem, and then we can talk numbers. They also thought that they were talking, that we'd had something of an agreement about borders, but when they got to Camp David, Israel started talking about annexing more land than what the Palestinians had expected, the map that you see, and the refugee issue was dropped. Refugee issue was dropped at Camp David. It really wasn't discussed because the Palestinians said, you went back on the border issue, so we're going to just drop this whole refugee issue. So the security issue was presented, as I showed you here. Israel wanted to hold on to the Jordan Rift Valley, mainly because at that time there was concern Israel needed a strategic depth. There was concern that a foreign army would try to cross the Jordan River, move across the 60 kilometers of the West Bank and attack Israel proper. And so Israel wanted to hold on to the Jordan Rift Valley. That had been a breaking point for a deal breaker in earlier talks with Jordan. It was certainly a deal breaker for the Palestinians, because how are you going to have a state if Israel is going to sit on your border with Jordan? When it comes to the other core issues, as I said, the idea was to annex as much territory as you could to accommodate maximum number of settlers. So obviously, this was no Palestinian leadership could accept this, and the Camp David talks failed, obviously. On Jerusalem, Barak was willing to make some compromise, and actually that was really the major issue that brought the talks to a close, because they weren't able to find a compromise on Jerusalem. Barak was willing to give up some of the areas in East Jerusalem where we had for the Palestinians, but he wanted to hold on to settlements in East Jerusalem. It's very complicated. The holy places Barak wanted to hold on to for Israel. Nothing was resolved about Jerusalem. After the failure of these talks, Barak claimed falsely that there was no partner, that he offered this great offer and the Palestinians turned it all down. In fact, this wasn't true, and Barak even told the Israeli military that it wasn't true, and he continued talking to the Palestinians. He continued the talks at Arafat even after the Camp David talks failed. In September there were talks, but the second intifada broke out mainly because the Palestinians were completely disillusioned and disappointed by the failure of Camp David, the failure of the talks. We can go to the next slide, please. Clinton tried to sum up what he thought could be an agreement. This is not an agreement. These are simply parameters that Clinton talked about, by which the solution could be that in terms of refugees, they would either stay where they were, they would go to another state like Canada, they would go to the Palestinian state, or they would come back to Israel. In other words, 4 possibilities. But anybody that was going to take them, including Israel, had to agree. So they would agree about numbers. That's just his proposal. That was Clinton's proposal. But I mention it here because these are the Clinton parameters have sort of remained as the model solution. For everything else, the borders and so forth, you can see here that the Palestinian state would be in almost all of the West Bank, with just certain enclaves for Israel to accommodate maximum number of settlers. These were ideas that were put out by Clinton, and they really can constitute the solution that many look to today on the refugee issue, on the border issue, on the settlements, and on security. For Jerusalem, he came up with the idea of sharing East Jerusalem, sharing the holy sites. We can go back to that. I could go to the next slide. The next set of negotiations were basically the Olmert-Abu Mazen talks. Now, it's listed here as Annapolis, but Annapolis was just a meeting, a ceremonial meeting. But then bilateral talks took place between Olmert and Abu Mazen, Abbas, and at another level, they took place between Tzipi Livni and Saeb Erekat. But the important talks were between Olmert and Palestinian President Chairman Abbas. And this is the map that Olmert presented to Abu Mazen in September of 2008. As you can see, Israel would annex only the blue areas, about 6.5% of the West Bank. The Palestinians would have a state in all of the West Bank. There would be some land swaps, those green areas, so that the Palestinians would have 100% of the square kilometers of the West Bank. But because we were going to annex a certain part, they would be compensated by swaps, which had also been in the Clinton proposals. So only about 6.5% would be annexed to Israel in this proposal. And they also talked about sharing Jerusalem, where many of the Israeli settlements would remain. There would be a joint ownership, a trusteeship of the holy places. I won't go into detail, but they did touch on all the critical issues, and they began to talk about numbers for return of the refugees. They didn't agree on numbers. As a matter of fact, they didn't really agree on anything. They came very, very close. The Palestinians said instead of 6.5%, they thought that Israel could take or annex only 1.9%, which was the actual land that the settlements were on in the West Bank. They didn't reach agreement. Abu Mazen never really responded to this map, which was never given to him. But in fact, after this, both Abu Mazen and Olmert said several times that they felt that they were very close on the territorial issue, where the borders would be and how much Israel would annex. They felt that they were very close on the refugee issue. It was a question of talking numbers. The Palestinians didn't say it outright, but they wanted 150,000 to return. Olmert talked only about 15,000. So they were still pretty far away, but they believed that they could reach an agreement. This is the tragedy, basically, is how close they came. It's the closest we've ever been to reaching an agreement, very close to the Clinton parameters, and very close to what both Olmert and Abu Mazen thought could be arranged. I just go on to the next slide and I'll show you a comparison of the different land for the Palestinian state. You can see Camp David with its what Israel wanted to hold on to and the way it wanted to swaps. We would give them 1 square kilometer for every 9 square kilometers we annexed. The Clinton parameters were much more fair. The Olmert proposal was even closer, and you can see the Abu Mazen. This, I think, is a very important slide to see the progress made, but Abu Mazen and Olmert were quite close. Now, I do want to say one thing. Even if we talk about Oslo and Yitzhak Rabin, we don't know if he really was going to go for a Palestinian state. We don't know for sure. But if we look at Rabin, at Barak, and we look at Olmert, their motivation, and by the way, it was also the case for Sharon, but I won't go into, the motivation was mainly demographics. They all realized that basically if Israel continued to hold on to the occupied territories, Jews would be outnumbered by the Palestinians, and we would become a de facto binational state with an Arab majority at some point. So it was really basically, in my opinion, there were other factors, but the major factor, I think, certainly for Rabin and for Olmert, who were both hawks. Rabin was the hawkish wing of the Labor Party. Olmert was from the Likud. Their primary motivation, I believe, was demographic. As I say, there were other motivations, but that was, I think, the primary motive. We can go on now to Trump. Next slide, Abby. Yeah, well, there we go. Trump calls this a vision for peace. It's really an archipelago, it's sort of a scattering of Palestinian areas and the settlements in between. But I just want to say, besides the territory, and Israel, of course, would annex the Jordan Rift Valley, everything that's there in the blue and white stripes, Israel would annex like crazy. But in addition to that, under the Trump, quote, vision for peace, Israel would maintain security for the whole area, anything west of the Jordan River. Israel would even have the final say about who and how many refugees could return to the Palestinian state. None would return to Israel. It's basically an Israeli proposal. The Trump vision is basically Israel's proposal. It's almost no other way to put it. I want to just, with the next slide, talk about some of the, next slide, please. Some of the lessons that we learned in the course of the negotiations, which obviously failed, but never really went into every issue and reached any kind of final position. The key issue for Israel throughout negotiations and in the future is security. Security plus a minimum dislocation of settlers. We don't want to have to evacuate tens of thousands of settlers. So for us, security is the major thing, but taking into account as many settlers as possible to remain in place. The key issues for the Palestinians are the borders. They need contiguous borders and not just enclaves, the which Trump gave them. And they need a sovereign state, which means that Israel won't be controlling their outer border with Jordan. Israel won't be controlling who can come in and who can come out or leave. The Jordan Rift Valley is the border between Palestine and Jordan. But what's important about this, and I think it's extremely important, if you go back to maps, you'll see that if Israel sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, which it wants to do today under Netanyahu and Trump, if you look at a map, if Israel is sitting in the Jordan Rift Valley, Israel will completely surround the state of Palestine territorially. All land entrances and exits to this Palestinian entity, all entrances and exits will be controlled by Israel if Israel is sitting in Area C or in the Jordan Rift Valley. Israel, of course, also wants to hold on to the airspace above and the electromagnetic field. The refugees in Jerusalem issues, the unofficial solutions were reached by Olmert and Abu Mazen. It was a question of numbers. Even Arafat and Barak discussed numbers, but of course, no final agreement was reached. The Clinton parameters on Jerusalem were more or less agreed to by Olmert and Abu Mazen. That is, East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. Some Jewish settlements or neighborhoods would remain in East Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty. The holy places would be governed jointly by Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and Palestine. These weren't finalized, but these were very close to final. In the lessons, I think we had to learn, and then this is not my interpretation, it was mentioned by Americans who were involved at Camp David. The Israeli negotiators go into the negotiations as if everything is ours. The whole land is ours, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, but we are going to be generous and we're going to let you have some of it. The Palestinians also go into negotiations saying, it's all ours, it was all Palestine, but we made a compromise. We made a pragmatic decision in 1988 to give up 78%. That's Israel. Now we just want the 22% for Palestinian state. So one of the lessons is that maybe instead of saying it's all ours exclusively, Israel should say, well, look, let's talk about interests and the needs of each side and try to work out a solution. Another lesson is that perhaps it'd be wise to avoid symmetry. Israel goes into negotiations saying, we're going to give a little, you Palestinians have to give a little, sort of a tit for tat, or Netanyahu called it once reciprocity. But the Palestinians believe that they already did that. They already made their compromise with the 78% that goes to Israel. So these are some of the lessons I think we learned from past negotiations that we have to bear. We have to abandon this all the land is ours approach and talk about how we can serve and resolve each other's needs and interests. Another lesson, which we'll get back to when we talk about today, is that a regional approach is a good idea, that is letting the states in the area have something of a say. A regional approach would provide some backing for Palestinian concessions on Jerusalem if they had to make any, and would give legitimacy or acceptance in the region for Israel, which is something Israel has always sought. So these are sort of the lessons that I think are important. The problem is, I think we have another slide. Could we go take a look and see if there's another slide?
Sure, and I actually just want to ask a really, can you hear me?
I think the important point
can you hear me?
Is that we are now, no, that's the end of that. I think we are now beyond these negotiations. The government of Netanyahu has said Israel will not ever agree to a Palestinian state anywhere, period. And also, Israel is today, with the current government of Israel, guided less by these key security issues and more by ideology. The idea of greater Israel or Eretz Israel, it's guided by that ideology, and of course, the religious element of that. I actually was going to mention the Arab Peace Initiative until yesterday. The Arab Peace Initiative was passed and accepted by all the Arab states in the Arab League, and also approved by all of the Muslim states, the 57 Islamic states. The Arab Peace Initiative was resolved by the Arab League in 2002. And basically, it's the Clinton parameters, more or less. It doesn't talk about where the border should be, but it says 2 states, Israel withdraws. There's a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with only East Jerusalem is the capital. There has to be, but the really new element was, for the first time, the Arabs said there has to be an agreement on the return of the refugees, but it has to be agreed upon. That was put in primarily by the Jordanians, who said nothing can be forced on Israel on the refugee issue. It has to be an agreed upon solution to the refugee issue. That was very important wording. If Israel was to withdraw from the West Bank, Palestinian state in with a capital in East Jerusalem, an agreed upon resolution of the refugee issue, then the Arab states would open normal relations with Israel and consider the Arab-Israeli conflict resolved, finished, over. That was fine until yesterday. And now we have the UAE, the United Arab Emirates agreement with Israel, which calls for normal relations with Israel without anything, by the way, of a Palestinian state being created or the refugee issue resolved or anything else. And I don't know if this means that the Arab Peace Initiative, by the way, later the Arab League added land swaps to accommodate the settlers. And it had been reconfirmed numerous times. I don't know if now the Arab Peace Initiative is worthless, because the whole idea of the Arab Peace Initiative was Israel withdraws, you have swaps, you have a Palestinian state, and now we can declare the whole conflict resolved, over, finished, and have normal relations. Now, one Arab state is giving us normal relations without our having withdrawn, without there being a Palestinian state. Other Arab states are rumored to be following, and then the Palestinians are left out in the cold. I want to end here, but I do want to say that it's very nice, and as an Israeli, I'm very pleased that we have relations or will have relations with another Arab state. But the Palestinian issue, the conflict between us and the Palestinians, is the core issue of the conflict. And until and unless we resolve the issue with the Palestinians, that it meets our demands and meets their demands in a maximum way, or as best we can for each side, until we resolve the conflict with the Palestinians, Israel will not be secure, and also we will basically continue to rule in what will become an apartheid state. In other words, I think both in terms of our security and our morality, we will not benefit until we resolve the issue with the Palestinians. That's basically, I think, my final point. I don't know how long I took, but I would love to answer questions if we have any.
Great. Yes, we have a nice solid 10 minutes for
I don't hear you, Abby.
Can you hear me now? How's that?
I still can't hear you.
I think it's the headphones, maybe. Try. Let's see. Everyone bear with me on this call. Let's see if I think it might be the headphones. I will write. Okay.
No,
Can you hear me now?
Can't hear you.
Okay. Well, just give me 1 second. Okay. So how about, I think maybe try to take out the headphones. Everyone can just be patient. We have still, let's see. Try that. Okay. Let's see. Trying to do some, you know, there we go.
Maybe I'll leave the Zoom and come back because I can't hear you.
I think it's actually, it's the
I'm going to leave and come back.
Okay.
Okay? Okay.
All right. So everyone's still in the call. You know, we live in an age of many Zoom complications. So, you know, we'll just give us a minute here and we'll be sure to answer some of your questions shortly. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can't hear
Yes.
you.
All right. Okay, let's see. I think what we're gonna try to do, everyone, again, very sorry.
Now I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great. So let's just launch right in. So we have many, many questions asked, really excellent variety of questions. I would really quickly like to just ask you a quick clarifying question, which is just in relation to the refugees that you mentioned. When you mentioned the right of return for refugees, did you mean that they should be returning to a future Palestinian state or to a Jewish state? Just out of curiosity.
Okay.
Quick clarifying.
The issue is, obviously, Israel said originally they can't return to Israel. And that's Netanyahu's position to this day. That they cannot, nobody can come back to Israel. The only thing is, in the negotiations, they reached a different agreement prior to Camp David. Barak and Arafat, or his negotiators, reached an agreement where the Palestinians said, look, if Israel will just acknowledge its role in the creation of the problem, we can then talk numbers. And they didn't really talk numbers at Camp David. But in the Olmert Abu Mazen talks and in the Clinton parameters, they began to think about numbers. And what Clinton said, and it's basically the model, is that some refugees will just stay where they are, some will go to the Palestinian state that's created, some will go to third countries like Canada, which generally accepts refugees, and some will go to Israel. But in every case, the host country, including Israel, will say how many they're going to take. So those are the Clinton parameters, and that's basically the solution. There have been other ideas, but Olmert and Abu Mazen began to talk numbers. They began to, and Olmert said, okay, 15,000 can come back. Well, that's nothing if you're talking, the Palestinians say they have 4 million refugees. Israel doesn't accept that figure, but never mind. And also, research has been done, and the Palestinians saying that the vast majority of refugees wouldn't come back, wouldn't even want to come back. Their homes are gone, their villages are gone, we destroyed them. But the closest we came was Abu Mazen Olmert. I know personally from other sources that the number that the Palestinians were talking about was 150,000 would actually be able to return. Olmert was nowhere close to that. He said 15,000. The Americans said, well, maybe 40,000. They were throwing out numbers, but we never got further along that line. But the point is, the issue itself has a solution. In the Clinton parameters, we see it. And Abu Mazen went on Israeli television a few years ago, and he said, we understand, we're not trying to change, and we will not change the character of Israel. We're not going to flood you with refugees, which is what, of course, is the fear in Israel, is that we're going to be flooded, where Jews will become a minority and so forth. So they made it very clear, look, they know what our issue is. But there it is. So the refugee issue is obviously a very important issue. Netanyahu is very clear. Trump is very clear. Trump says that even the refugees that go to a Palestinian state has to have an Israeli approval. And the Trump plan is just off the wall. Okay.
Okay, so the next question. This question is coming from Linda Saylor. What were the reasons for the failure of the 2008 Olmert-Abbas talks?
Yeah, we don't know. To this day, we don't know. What happened is that Olmert showed the map, the map I showed you. Olmert showed it to Abu Mazen. I think it was the 13th of September or something like that. And he wouldn't give it to him, though. He said, this is the map, but he wouldn't give it to him. Olmert, Abu Mazen sort of drew his idea about it and took it back to the Palestinians. And he never came back. He said to Olmert, I'm going to come tomorrow. with some map specialists, some experts, and we can continue talking. Instead of coming back, he went to Jordan and Egypt. And Olmert, from what I understand, thought, oh, well, he's consulting. That's a good sign. But he never came back. And nobody knows why, except for a couple things that have come out. Olmert had already announced his resignation from the leadership of the Likud. He was about to be indicted. And this was known. Tzipi Livni was about to become head of the Likud. So if we try to look from the outside in, from the Palestinian point of view, Olmert was not only a lame duck, he was no longer the leader. He was not just a lame duck. We also know from other sources that there were those Israelis, possibly from the Barak camp, we don't know. It was actually the Americans who revealed this. There were Israelis who told the Palestinians, wait, Olmert's on his way out, you may get a better deal. I don't know how much that influenced it. To this day, we don't know why Abu Mazen never came back, except for the things that I mentioned, the timing. However, months later, both Abu Mazen and Olmert said over and over, this is where we were. We were very close to agreement. Olmert said 6.5% annexation. Abu Mazen said 1.9, and they both said we were very close. We just needed a few more months maybe of negotiation, and we would have had an agreement. Your guess is as good as anybody else's guess. It may have been the mistake of a lifetime that Abu Mazen didn't come back. On the other hand, Olmert really wasn't in power after that. He had already announced his resignation, and very soon after that, he was indicted, he went to jail, and there we are. The great tragedy, in my opinion, is that Olmert was a crook. That's the tragedy. He was my student, he was my neighbor, I like him, and he was willing to do it. And he was willing to do it, I think, because of the demographic issue. He was Likudnik, he was a son of the founding fathers. And I think it was, he saw, and he said it, he gave his reasons. We were headed for a binational state if we continued to occupy the territories.
Okay, I'm going to we're going to go with 2 more questions and then we're going to close the session. So the next question is coming from Miriam Chernoff, who asks, why do people still say that Palestinians do not recognize Israel?
Oh,
is there a statement still in their charter?
No, they took it out of the charter because they took it out of the charter. Now, the right wing in Israel claimed that didn't make any difference. They had promised, that was one of the conditions in the whole Oslo agreements. And they actually held a meeting, they took it out of the charter, and then the right wing in Israel said, no, you didn't really do that. So they held another meeting and Clinton came, it was televised. And again, they raised their hands and they voted to take it out of the charter. They did not issue a new charter. And so the right wing in Israel says, until there's a new charter, without this statement about this destroying the state of Israel, we don't like it. We don't accept it. However, I showed you the Arafat letter to Rabin, and also the 1988 decision by the PLO, Palestinian National Council, which belongs to PLO, in which each time they said they recognized Israel's right to exist. So what happened with that? Bibi Netanyahu added another condition. He added, it's not enough that you recognize our existence, and it's not enough that you recognize our right to exist. And for Israel, the importance is the right, our legitimacy. Netanyahu said, you have to recognize our right to exist as a Jewish state. Well, that's a problem apparently for them. They won't do that because there's a Palestinian population who were citizens of Israel, 20% of our population. So if we're a Jewish state, what happens to, this is the whole issue. Now, I don't want to let them off too easily. The recognition of Israel's right to exist is not in question. It literally is not in question. Netanyahu added this clause. However, I do think we have to acknowledge there is an issue, which will not prevent a two-state solution, because they've already agreed to a two-state solution and recognition of our right to exist. But nonetheless, Palestinians, for the most part, do not accept Judaism as a nationality. They do not believe we are a people. They say we're a religion, but we're not a people. And if we're not a people, then what right do we have to self-determination? The same way the Israelis say there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. What Begin used to say, the Arabs of Eretz Israel. So it's this, do you have a right to self-determination? And if you're a people, if you're a nation, now I'm a secular Jew. I immigrated to Israel because I'm a secular Jew. I didn't feel any connection with Judaism as a religion, in a synagogue. I don't go to a synagogue, except maybe occasionally for my kids and my grandchildren. But I came here because I believe that there is a Jewish people, and I belong to that Jewish people, and I feel we have a right to a state. We also have a need for a state. The same way I believe there are Palestinians, but we can't overlook that. This is something that the PLO basically overlooked and said, okay, two states, because they took a pragmatic position. But I have no illusions. I have a lot of Palestinian friends. I know what they think, but they also know that there's no way that they're going to have their own state unless they accept the state of Israel, which they did. Now, Netanyahu has said to the Americans, he said it to Trump in the very first meeting in Washington, said they don't recognize us, and that's a lie. It's a lie. They have recognized, and they've recognized our right to exist, and that's what we wanted from them. That's what we asked for. The wording of the PLO statement that I showed you, that wording was dictated by Israel to the Americans who dictated it to Arafat. That's the wording we want. We don't want to, you recognize us, we're here. We wanted recognition of our right to be a state with secure and recognized borders. And, you can add things, but they really add complications, but Netanyahu said very clearly, he doesn't want a Palestinian state. He said it, okay. So nothing else really matters. You have to sort of find excuses, but there it is.
Thank you. So I know we said we would have one more question, but in the interest of time, I'm going to have to just wrap up our J School session here.
I just want to say one thing, Abby. I'll send you the full PowerPoint that has lots and lots of statements in it, lots of maps. And if you want to distribute that, I think it would be a good idea to fill in many of the things that we couldn't say.
Excellent. Yes, I'm actually in our Q&A box. We're getting requests already for the slides, so that would be greatly appreciated.
I'll send you the big one, not just the little one.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Dr. Golan, thank you so much for just giving us this presentation. I think it's really just fascinating and interesting and important, especially, as you said, given the current climate with the UAE, kind of wanting to normalize with Israel. It's just really important that we hear from you, an expert, a true expert on this topic, and a friend of J Street, and a very knowledgeable woman in her field. And I think this audience is that much better off for it. So thank you for teaching us. It was an honor. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience to please, if you have time in the beginning or middle of your day, to please join our follow-up discussion group led by J Street staff members, and see you next week. Thanks again, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. My pleasure.
Bye. Bye.